Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. After weeks of bruising campaign which divided the people within families, towns and villages, Scotland has voted to stay with the United Kingdom. The referendum saw 55% voting against independence, while 45% voted in its favour. Even as those who campaigned long and hard for gaining independence absorbed the shock of defeat, the leaders have already started talking language of reconciliation. The task, according to many, are easier said than done. Prime Minister David Cameron, who has made several promises to avert an yes vote for independence, now faces the tough task of walking the talk. The entire political system faces the challenge of reconciling, as other parts like Wales, North Ireland as well as England itself will watch carefully the concessions offered to Scotland. Today we will discuss the implications of the result of the referendum and what it means to the United Kingdom. To discuss this, I have with me Nihal Singh, veteran journalist and editor, Aditya Mukherjee, historian and professor at the Centre for Historical Studies, JNU, and Patrick French, a British writer and historian. Welcome to all of you. Patrick, I would like to come to you first. How do you read this vote? Is this, as some people say, the United Kingdom has been saved, or is it that the Scotland has failed to get its independence?
Well, I mean, personally, I think it's a good thing that the United Kingdom has remained united, but it was a very close vote. I used to live in Scotland when I was at college, and you could see then all of the initial stirrings of the very strong nationalist, anti-English feeling and really the demand for separation. And because it's a close vote, it will be quite difficult to heal those rifts. But what I think is definitely going to happen is that the UK, which tends to be a very centralised society, is going to devolve power to the different parts of the nation, and also it's going to devolve power, at a regional level in a way that hasn't been done before. And I think the upshot of that is that Scotland will have much greater control over its own affairs, but also England will no longer have the situation where, for example, Scottish MPs are able to vote at Westminster to determine legislation that only affects the English. So you're seeing a little bit of a rise of English nationalism alongside the Scottish vote.
How do you see that, the rise of English nationalism? The Welsh will also now start looking at what you're going to give Scotland. The Irish also will start looking. So, will we see more such nationalism emerging in the different regions?
Well, I think the nationalism has certainly been bubbling up for the last 10, 20 years. So I don't think it will necessarily grow, but I do think that the political rearrangement of saying that the dispersal of powers, the reduction of the power of London in particular, is going to be something that stirs up everyone. But I think what may happen is rather like with the Quebec vote in Canada, the decision to remain united but to realign how the political system works in the UK may in fact be beneficial, because as I said earlier, it is far too centralised a country, and successive governments since the Second World War have simply failed to make the necessary changes. In other words, they've postponed and postponed, and eventually things have now come to a crisis, and there will now be a change.
Okay, stay on, Patrick. I'll get back to you soon. Mr. Nihal Singh, there is this feeling that this was a working class versus upper class kind of thing. The working class wanted an independence. The upper class is quite happy being within the United Kingdom. You think? Do you look at it that way, or how do you look at it in the larger context?
Not really. I don't think so. But obviously, the richer people had greater links with England in particular and Europe in general. No, I look at it as a phenomenon which is spreading throughout Europe, throughout the developed world. Basically, you have a problem where European Union has brought people together in a sense. It has decimated regional
identities,
aspirations, etc. So now this is the backlash. That's one point.
So it's kind of a revival of their identities and wanting to be.
Well, I think local identities become very important when you merge nationalities up to a point. So that is one aspect of it. And the other is that the Scottish generally are left of centre, unlike Britain.
Right.
especially under the Conservatives. You know that the Conservatives have only one member in the Scottish Parliament.
Okay.
I mean, that's how
That
it is.
shows what it is.
Yes, and also I think they're afraid about losing welfare measures like free university education,
Yes.
which is remarkable, and free health.
National Health Service.
So these are some of the factors I think that have contributed to this.
Patrick, would you agree with Mr. Nihal Singh on this?
I would, up to a point. I think there certainly is a growth of nationalism and of identity politics taking place across Europe and, in fact, in many other parts of the world as well. So the kind of 20th century democratic, secularist, nationalist projects where there were large new nations developing in many parts of the world, that has really been put aside by people going back to some smaller identity which they would relate to perhaps the traditions that maybe their grandparents would have come out of. So that's something that probably a generation ago nobody would have expected. But again and again you get that assertion of identity, which then results in a demand for example, a smaller state where you can say, we're going to rule ourselves, we're going to be free of the larger power. And I mean, the irony of this in the case of Scotland is that the Union has lasted for more than 300 years. And the British Empire, when it was at its most powerful, was disproportionately filled by people from Scotland. So the narrative that you've had in recent years of saying, oh, well, the Scots are oppressed by the English, rather forgets the fact that for a couple of hundred years, many other countries in the world were oppressed by the Scots as well as the English.
Okay. Professor Mukherjee, it's very interesting. Historically, how things have changed. What Patrick is saying is very interesting.
You know, what I think is what is momentous about this is not which side has won. But for the first time, the process of nation-making or unmaking is attempted in a democratic manner.
Absolutely.
That is the main thing.
Absolutely.
Because the process of nation-making in Europe in the 19th century when it started, it did not happen without violence.
Right.
You know, France was a multilingual country. You flattened it out, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the process of nation-breaking. And we've seen in our borders, after all, the breakup of Pakistan into two countries within 25 years was not a non-violent affair.
Yes.
So I think here was a vote, and if they had lost, you know, it would have made a big change, and it was going to happen democratically.
Right.
I think there is a lot to learn from this, and for us particularly, in many ways, multinational nations like ours,
right.
we need to learn a lesson from this. That how do we deal with similar aspirations that are bound to come up and have periodically come up? I think there is a lesson there from this.
That's very interesting. In fact, Patrick, this is the aspect which many people are also, as Aditya Mukherjee says, that there is a lesson for many other countries and especially India also. Would you look at it like that? This very democratic referendum which happened?
Well, in some ways, I do think it is admirable that Britain was able to have this referendum and, Scots were able to decide on their own future. But whether you should extend that example all around the world, I rather doubt. I think it could cause far graver problems and potential violence in other countries. And I think that also the referendum, as it happened in the UK, was partly connected to, if you like, localized political matters. So, for example, the terms of the referendum were very much favourable towards the Scottish nationalists. So, for example, if you were Scottish but you lived in another part of the UK, you lived in Birmingham or you lived in London, you were not allowed to vote. But if you came from a different part of the world, like, let's say, Belgium or France, and were living in Scotland, you were allowed to vote. So this was something that was really geared in favour of Scottish nationalism, and despite that, most Scots voted to remain part of a United Kingdom.
Why do you think they voted to remain part of the United Kingdom?
Because I think that although the movement led by the Scottish nationalists was very good at appealing to the heart, making people feel passionate about their history and their identity and the idea that they could have a new kind of freedom, behind that, in a maybe more quiet, more conservative way, many Scots felt, well, I'm proud to be Scottish, of course, but I'm also proud to be British. And they didn't like the way that they were forced to make some kind of distinction between their Scottish identity and their British identity, rather in the same way that you might have somebody saying, for example, I'm a proud Bengali, but I'm also a proud Indian. I think that many people didn't like having to make that choice.
And what about the question which I asked Mr. Nihal Singh earlier? So I know I was watching some of your the BBC and the kind of analysis which was going on there. There's some analysts who feel that the S vote majorly came from the
Yes.
working class, while the no vote came from the upper class, the richer class, who were more comfortable, as Mr. Nihal Singh was saying, with Britain.
I mean, there is some truth in that, but I don't think you can really say that generally that was the case. I think one of the difficulties with the pro-independence movement is that they never solved fundamental economic questions like what currency were they going to use. They said, for example, we will continue to use the UK pound, despite the fact that they would have then had no central bank of their own. They would have had no control, if you like, over the currency that they were using. So you could argue that business leaders and big banks and big businesses were saying, well, independence would be an economic disaster. And to that extent, the, quotes, richer people were supporting the idea of union. But it wasn't really quite as simple as that. I think you had people from all sorts of different walks of life feeling strongly in favor of one view or the other. And interestingly, many families were split on this.
Yes.
It wasn't something where you could say, oh, people from this place or this type all were in favor of independence or in favor of union.
Okay, Mr. Nihal Singh, so it was an emotional thing, the whole thing. I mean, it has been building up for years. As Patrick himself said, as a student when he was in Edinburgh, he has seen these kind of things happening. So over a number of years, it has built up, but now they didn't succeed.
Well, I think it has been building up, yes, of course, but I think there is such a thing as Scottish nationalism, and that has grown over the years. Secondly, I think there is an ideological difference between, particularly the English conservatives and Scotland, which has been accentuated since Tony Blair's days and his neo-conservative, neoliberal policies. So that is one very factor. But I'd like to come back on your earlier question about what made them say
No.
no. And I think it was a fear of the unknown.
Fear of the unknown.
Because they didn't know what would happen tomorrow. They didn't know,
There were enough doubts raised in their mind.
Yes, they didn't know. But the fact that they got, you can't underestimate it, 1.6 million votes.
Right.
Is something. And with 85%, 45%.
All it needed was 3-4% here and there, and things would have...
So there is a very strong sense of Scottish nationalism, and you cannot underestimate it.
Right.
But of course, one consequence of this vote has been that the English now are demanding special privileges because they said, look, they are, of course, the largest percentage by far. I mean, they're over 50% of the United Kingdom. And they are saying, well, why shouldn't we have an English parliament, apart from the UK parliament, where we can decide on our own issues and not let others do it? After all, Scots don't let us do it in their case. And of course, the other point is the devolution of further powers, which have been promised by Cameron.
Yes.
So, well...
It's going to be tough. Professor Mukherjee?
I think there are two things involved here. As I think Patrick also mentioned, the issue of identities. But it is not only an issue of identity. I mean, if you compare, let's say, the Irish situation and the Scottish situation, there is sometimes you may have the same identity, but you have a relationship which is exploitative. The kind of situation you saw in Pakistan. Bangladesh had similar, and identity-wise, Islam identity-wise, it was the same.
Right.
Language identity-wise, it was not the same. So there are a number of issues involved. In the Irish relationship with Britain, there was clearly a colonial relationship, and that is why the resistance did occur, and that's why part of Ireland broke off.
Right.
Now, in the Scottish situation, that doesn't appear to have been a major factor at all. Secondly, the tendency in Europe, in fact globally, we are seeing two different tendencies happening simultaneously. One is to actually forget about the borders. I mean, after all, what are we seeing? Nation was all about creating borders.
Right.
And the European Union, the first thing it does away is with borders.
Exactly.
You know, so that is the way Europe has been moving in the recent past. Yet, in the new situation, new global situation that we are seeing in the last quarter of 20th century onwards, are these two different phenomena. On the one hand, you're wanting to form bigger and bigger units, and on the other, you're also getting these tendencies to create small nations. You know, so here in this Scottish referendum, we saw both these aspects playing their part. You know, identity, the possibility of survival as a small country, North Sea oil, the economic possibility, which has now become possible for many parts of this world, on the one hand. And all of these were played together. And I believe that the fact that the tendency is towards joining hands and making your economy more viable is what won over in the end.
So was it the economy finally, Patrick? And as Mr. Nihal Singh says, the fear of the unknown?
I think it probably was the economy for many people. I mean, you know, ultimately when somebody decides, am I going to vote for one party or the other at a general election, or if they vote in a referendum, it comes down to economic self-interest. Is my family going to be better off or worse off under this new arrangement? So probably for a lot of people, they did think it's just too dangerous to try to go it alone in this way, particularly when there are so many uncertainties. You have so many large banks who've simply said, we're going to move out of Scotland and shift our headquarters down to England. You had the uncertainty over the currency. You had the uncertainty about whether an independent Scotland would have been able to join the European Union. So I think that all of those things combined to make people think, well, do we want to make the leap into the unknown? Probably not. The final point I'd make, though, is that I think Scottish nationalism is here to stay. As the other panellists have pointed out, whichever way you look at it, a significant number of people have voted in favour of independence, certainly a larger proportion of the population than in opinion surveys, say, 10 years ago. So unless there is a very significant transfer of power to make the government in Edinburgh the Parliament in Edinburgh able to implement policies in its own way, for example, decide its own tax-raising powers and so on. Unless that devolution of power happens successfully, then I think this is going to run and run. And of course, the growth of English devolution is going to be very interesting because it will mean almost certainly that Labour MPs from Scotland in Westminster have reduced powers. So you could have a situation at future general elections when the Labour Party starts to find it very difficult to form a majority. So if you like, the more right-wing aspects of English life are quite likely to assert themselves in the future, at least at an economic level.
Oh, that's very interesting what you said. Just one more point, one more question, Patrick. Do you think that the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has overstretched himself by the kind of devolutions which he has promised? Will he be able to walk the talk?
Well, I mean, he has set himself a very quick timetable. He said, you know, not only are we going to transfer powers, tax-raising powers, to Scotland and devolve power, but we're also going to rearrange the arrangements in relation to what happens in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And to implement that constitutionally at the beginning of next year, as he said he plans to, is going to be very difficult to do. And I think his calculation is that he should be able to bounce the Labour Party into agreeing with him simply because of the momentum of the vote, and that in turn would weaken the Labour Party. So, if you like, he's taking quite a high-risk strategy, and at the moment it's difficult to see whether he will pull that off or not.
Mr. Nihal Singh, how would you look at this? Has he overstretched himself? Because as you were pointing out, and several articles and analysts have also been pointing out that the demand, the more he tries to give to Scotland, the more will be the demand from England and from Wales and Northern Ireland.
Well, personally, I feel that Mr. Cameron's political future is quite uncertain now. Either way, I agree that it will be a very difficult task to fulfill, but he has to fulfill it, or at least try to. And the other point is what happens to the future of the largest part of the United Kingdom, which is England.
Right.
And if, as was suggested, if it goes more conservative, then where does Scotland stay? Because as it is, Scotland is left of what what England and what the UK government represents at the moment through the Conservative Party. There's also the prospect of, the referendum promised on the European Union's future, whether Britain should stay in it or not, in 1917, if the Conservatives remain in power, which is doubtful, because 2015 is the next year election. So it's a moment of many uncertainties, which is not good for either Mr. Cameron or for Britain.
Or for Britain, or for even Scotland included. Professor Mukherjee?
As for this question whether Cameron did the right thing or not, I think he had no other option.
I think Patrick wants to react. Yes, Patrick. You want to react to what Mr. Nihal Singh said?
Well, I do. I actually have to go to another engagement now. Okay. But what I would say is that the decision on the 2017 referendum on European Union membership is very closely bound up with this decision. So it's almost as if you have a sort of moment of accelerated history. Rather like India in the 1940s, when things are happening one on top of the other very, very quickly. So essentially what the Prime Minister David Cameron has to do is he has to keep enough English voters on side through the devolution of powers to them in the wake of the Scottish referendum, to make sure that in 2017, when the European Union vote happens, there's not a vote to withdraw from the European Union by people who simply feel that old-style politics or Westminster politics as usual has betrayed them. Because if that did happen, what you could then see is a situation where England was significantly weakened vis-à-vis Scotland, and yet at the same time it was outside the European Union. I mean, I personally think that would be catastrophic. It would leave England very dangerously isolated. But because of the general anti-establishment, anti-politician anger that you see, particularly in England and in other parts of the UK, that is a very real risk. So, watch this space. And I think you're going to have to do more TV shows about this over the course of the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and very quickly, last, Patrick, though David Cameron seems to have won this round, he has got himself into a big challenge. Would you agree with that?
He's got a big challenge, but I would say this for him, which is that he tends to work best when his back is against the wall. Whenever he's found himself in a difficult situation, it's almost as if his real talent has shone through. So he's one of those politicians who quite likes to be in a tight corner.
Okay, thanks for joining us, Patrick. I'll let you go now. You said you have to go somewhere. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes. Professor Mukherjee?
I started by saying that what impact it has on India. I'm not a Scotland specialist or England specialist, but I think there's lots to learn from this. Apart from the fact that I said that this process has been attempted democratically, I think the lesson will be learned here as well. In the sense, there are sections, parts of India which have been asking for separate nationhood. And what will they learn from it? And what does India learn from this? I think is an important question. That are we, for example, are we going to accept this, that you have a referendum and if one part of the region says we want to be an independent nation, are you going to accept it? Or are you not? And I think some deep thinking needs to occur. Are you going to, of course this is the right thing to do. That if an overwhelming majority of our people want something, you have to accept that.
This is the way to do it.
This is the way to do it. But at the same time, at one point of time, for example, I think Patrick mentioned this, look at the speed at which things happen in India from 1940 to 1947. Till then you are making one nation. Yes. And in 7 years' time, you are making two nations. Similarly, you can do a vote in, let's say, Punjab at one point where everybody is so scared, including the judges and the professors, that everybody says that Khalistan is correct. You do another referendum 5 years later when there is no fear out there, and you get exactly the opposite. So a lot of thinking has to go into, doing even a democratic thing. Are you going to do it at one shot? Will you give it, and like you do with the judges do often, that you do one referendum, then after 1 year we'll do another one, and that will be decisive, or whatever. I'm thinking of so many.
Taking lessons from it.
It's a very interesting idea, but I think it's totally impractical in Indian circumstances because we are a new nation state, don't forget that. And the concept and the fear of the leadership, whichever party, main party, would be that this would be a very dangerous precedent, however you do it.
This is the leadership's mindset.
I think
you're talking of the leadership's mindset, not the people's mindset.
Well, after all, the leadership guides the people.
Guides the people. Supposed to guide the people.
And also what we saw from Cameron. You see, what is the response? The response is to give as much power, to accommodate and things like that.
At least. Promise.
So, promise and try to.
Yeah.
So if you do not accommodate...
you will have no choice but to try and do it as...
but if you do not accommodate a democratic demand, not out of fear, not out of militancy, then you will have Bangladeshis. After all, Bangladesh is the creation of not accepting a democratic reality.
Absolutely. Mr. Nihal Singh, do you think that people in other parts of the world, including India, will take a lesson from this kind of a democratic exercise? That if there is going to be any such situations in any country in the future like this is the way to go about it. Would this become a model?
I don't see it as a precedent for India or most of the new nation states of the world, because I think the overall fear of the consequences would be so great.
Why was that fear not present in Britain? How did they allow it?
Because Britain is an established nation state. And after all, this union was 307 years old.
Right.
So it didn't happen yesterday. I mean, it was a very long-term kind of a thing. But if you have a new nation state, the accent will always be to try to cement people together. But of course, as far as Bangladesh is concerned, it was a dictatorship.
Right.
Don't forget, it was a military dictatorship which brutalized the people in the end and didn't listen to, after all, there was a vote in favor of Mujibur Rahman's party, yes, and that was dishonored. So where do you go from there? So it was a different kind of a thing.
So, Professor Mukherjee, very quick last words. You think that, the way it is, will it bring...
Nation states are not going to be breaking up like that. Of course, and as he said correctly, especially nation states which need to hang together. That is the reality. Why? That increasingly you want to form bigger and bigger units. So surely it is not as if tomorrow you have an election and we let go that part of the country. Leave alone England. It is quite amazing that England accepted it. Suppose if California says tomorrow that, that we want to be a separate country, is the United States going to accept it? It's not going to be in a hurry, these changes. That's why I think it is momentous. It is a very momentous thing that this was attempted, and we need to think about it.
Absolutely. I think on that note, we will end this show. It was indeed a momentous thing that something so democratic happened that, it all went off so pretty smoothly at the end of the day. But the challenge actually, as my panelist earlier, Patrick French and Mr. Nihal Singh, everybody is saying that the challenge actually lies now. The real challenge lies now for the Prime Minister and for all politicians in the United Kingdom. Everybody will be watching keenly how this will, evolve over the next few months. Thanks to all my guests, Patrick French, who had joined us earlier, Aditya Mukherjee and Nihal Singh. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue in the big picture, same time on Monday. Meanwhile, have a great weekend.